Now, today is the day I need someone to run in and bring me another Coke. What's the chance that will happen twice in this semester? You know how like in like older times, like the students would bring like the teacher an apple, you know, kind of court favor. Yeah, for me, it's like Coke and Pepsi. I used to drink like 80 ounces a day. It wasn't healthy. Paper for paper airplanes. All right, so what time is class on Thursday? There is no class on Thursday. What is there on Thursday? Midterms due by 12:30. And where do you turn those in? Email them to me. You email them as 3 separate documents. One document, reports. All right. Good. So today's lecture is for the second exam. All right. Inevitably, like 3-5 people will write about this for their test. Don't do that. You're just wasting your time. We'll give you a 0 on it and you'll have to redo it. All right. So this is material for test the second midterm. Just I needed to give you extra time to complete your first midterms. That's why we're moving on to new material. So that clear? All right, good. So then let's get to it. We begin today and next week the discussion of those founding fathers. Right, you've already been reading a little bit about them in Maclay. If you've done the third discussion board, you'll continue to do so. Today and into next week, we will be talking about the founding fathers and kind of my perspective. And instantly, we're confronted with a little bit of a potential diversion between Maclay and I think what Maclay stresses in chapter 3 is that to understand our founding fathers, we need to understand this period of benign neglect on the part of England. That England set out as colonists, but then didn't keep a very tight eye on them. And so the colonies were able to develop very independently of England. And this helps explain ultimately why there would be a decision for independence in 1776. And so what Maclay stresses is kind of a gradual parting of the ways between the 1600s and even into the 1700s. I kind of go a different direction. I follow historians who stress that, yes, there was a period of benign neglect in the 1600s when England is sending out colonists, but England itself is a mess. I think I've said this before. England wasn't even a monarchy for about 13 years in the middle of the 1600s. It's not until they're sending out colonists as early as 1607, right, Jamestown. It's not until 1689 that things really settle down. The Glorious Revolution installs William and Mary. And finally, kind of England has its house in order. It's figured out how it's going to share power between the monarchy and parliament, and things settle down. So there is a period of benign neglect, but after 1689, I follow historians who say that what actually is going on is that the colonies in England are actually becoming more entwined with each other. There's actually closer connections between the colonies and the so-called metropole, namely London and England. Those connections are deepening. And so to understand the founding fathers, we need to understand them as, I'm calling them the New Englishmen, people who were a part of this movement towards closer connections with England. And here, I don't know that you have to choose between Maclay and I. This is probably relevant for those of you who are thinking about how maybe for your first test, an observation on Maclay and I might work together. I don't know if you necessarily have to choose between Maclay and I. I don't know that, saying in some ways the colonies are developing independently of England, but in other ways, the colonies are developing more closely to England, that those are mutually exclusive. In other words, it's not necessarily an either or between Maclay and I. It could be a both and. That we're just looking at or stressing different things or different levels of evidence. But there's not necessarily an irrepressible conflict between them. You find this you find this throughout the study of history, is that what looks like conflict might just be two people who are kind of looking at different evidences. And so it's not that either one is right and the other is wrong, is that they're both right, just given kind of where they're or what they're looking at. And so I'm not trying to, in other words, in this lecture, trying to undercut Maclay and say he's wrong about the colonies developing a sense of independence and self-identity as Americans. I think they absolutely are. Nevertheless, the things that I'll be explaining here also is evidence that demands some kind of verdict. And so I'm stressing that the people we call our founding fathers were actually a part of this movement of the colonies becoming more connected to England. And we'll talk about how it is that leads to the decision for independence then. It's a bit of an ironic story that I'm telling. But first off, which one is George Washington? Left or right, which one is Washington? What's that? One is, come on, you're good Americans and American schools and stuff. You saw pictures of George Washington. Which one is him? Which one is Washington? I'm hearing some votes for left. Is there a consensus for left? Do we need to vote on this? Who's going to raise their hand and say left? and other people just aren't quite sure what to do. It is, in fact, the left. Who's the other guy? That's William Pitt the Younger, the head of Parliament during George Washington's day. My point is that these people we call our founding fathers were going to great lengths to look like their English counterparts. And we'll see how that relationship came about. The technical name for this process we're looking at would be Anglicanizing, but Anglican, what does that mean? So I'm using just Englishizing. The colonies are becoming more English after 1689 and up to 1776. And to understand the coming of the American Revolution, you need to understand this process by which the colonies became more English, not simply less English. Now, this is a process that should be familiar to you. You live in a world that has been substantially Americanized, right? When we talk about Americanization, what are we talking about? Give me examples of Americanization. We're talking about the world being Americanized. What would be an example of that? What's that? McDonald's like everywhere. Like you can go to China, you can go to Jordan, and there's McDonald's there. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. American culture in this case, fast food, all around the world. There's thousands of McDonald's everywhere. Domino's too. My first meal in Jordan was actually Domino's pizza. KFC probably even more so. The world loves fried chicken. The world absolutely loves fried chicken. They love KFC. Other examples of Americanization? Certainly our products, our businesses, but okay, yeah, I mean our media products, right? I mean that's our primary export. It's been our primary export for a long time. Hollywood films. Most movies watched in the world are produced by Hollywood. Might change in the 21st century. Korea's media is coming up pretty strong. But yeah, our cultural products, so our music, our pop music, our movies, our TV shows. I mean, if at one point, I don't know if it's this case anymore, but at one point, if you wanted to like represent American influence in the world, and be glad I'm sparing you the picture, you would have to look at David Hasselhoff's Bare Chest. Baywatch, watched in over 144 different countries in the world. This was American influence in the world. It was watching Baywatch and watching a half-naked David Hasselhoff run around. It's not Christianity and missionaries it's David Hasselhoff. That's what we gave the world. We gave the world David Hasselhoff. Yeah. We could probably talk about politics too, and to what extent other countries' political systems have tried to model themselves after the United States as well too. But the point is, we live in a world in which American culture, American ways of doing things, have spread well beyond the United States and well beyond North America, and influence people all over the world. Consumerism, and particularly the American lifestyle, is probably the most influential thing, right? I mean, what we think of as normal, a high-producing, high-consuming lifestyle where we work ourselves to death because we're spending ourselves to death, and then we have to keep working ourselves to death because of all the money we're spending, right? Which we think of as normal, or you're all in college so you can aspire to become a high-producing, high-consuming individual, more, enhance your ability to become a high-producing, high-consuming individual. This is a more uniquely American thing, but it is something that we have given the world. It's one thing, people pointed this out, it's one thing when you have like 300 million people all producing a high producing, high consuming lifestyle. What happens when you have 7 billion people all producing that? It doesn't work. 300 million people can get away with it. 7 billion people, the planet can't handle that. And so we're either going to have to figure out how to get more out of like the moon and Mars and stuff, or something's going to have to change. But I'm now getting into like core 2 stuff. So let's just get back on track. My point is this Englishizing of the colonies, you know what I'm talking about, right? It is the spread of English culture and English ways of doing things throughout its empire, in this case, into North America. This was not really happening during the 1600s, as I said, and Maclay calls that period of neglect, because England was happy to get rid of people because England was a mess. I mean, it was in civil war in the middle of that decade. And so it takes from the time that they start colonizing to the time that they actually settle kind of internally their issues about 70 years or so. But once they settle those issues, they immediately begin to try to assert control over the colonies, and they're actually quite successful in doing so. So let's talk about some different dimensions of this. Politically, the colonies will become more connected to England after 1689. One evidence for this is Massachusetts. Massachusetts, you know, those Puritans who are trying to establish a model theocracy. The Puritans left England. They didn't really want to be under royal influence. They don't want to have the crown telling them what to do. And they were largely able, because of conditions in England, the Puritans were largely allowed to do what they wanted to. Yes, they created what they thought was a model Christian society. Along the way, they were also able to execute Quakers and Baptists and women that they considered to be witches, right? I mean, that's what the Puritan theocracy was in part about, besides the Native American wars too. But that can't continue. In the second half of the 1600s, England looks to bring its colonies, in this case, Massachusetts, under its control. Now, we talked about Bacon's Rebellion, right? After Bacon's Rebellion, Virginia's settlement was begging for England, please come and take more control. Please come and assert more authority over us. We need you. They welcomed increased royal authority. In England, in New England, they resisted it, but they had their own catastrophic event as well too, King Philip's War that we talked about, that set the Puritan establishment in a much more weakened state and allowed England administrators to come in and assert more control. The King of England in New England was named Sir Edmund Andros. Andros was appointed by James II to go into the colonies, to bring the colonies in line. Virginia, the Chesapeake, Andros really had no problem. They were happy to work with him. New England, they resisted Andros to the point Andros got so fed up with Massachusetts that in 1785, Andros just took their charter away from them. Massachusetts wasn't even a colony anymore in 1785. They didn't have their own government. Yes. Sorry, 1680. 1680. Virginia, the Chesapeake region, the southern colonies. Yeah, they were asked. They were willing to accept that support. In New England, they're resisting it, but they're in a difficult situation because of the aftermath of King Philip's War. So Andros, fed up with the Puritans, will take away their charter in 1685. It will be restored in 1691, but with a couple of changes. Massachusetts now has a royal governor, a governor appointed by the king, and to vote in Massachusetts society, you no longer had to be a member of the church. If you wanted to put an end date to the Puritan theocracy, it was 1691. It began in 1629, and in 1691, when the king and the king's authorities said, You don't have to be members of churches anymore to vote. The Massachusetts situation, being forced to accept a royal governor, taking away their, changing their voting system, is just one evidence of this point I'm trying to make. The colonies, originally allowed to develop independently, are being tied more closely back to England. All the colonies at the time of independence will have royal governors, including those who did not have them at first, like the New England colonies. So politically, North America is being tied closer to England. Economically, being tied closer as well, too. Colonial theory is you send out people, they establish colonies, but they exist to benefit the motherland. So people were set out from England to establish North America. Those colonies, whether in Virginia or New England, all their actions were intended to benefit the motherland. In that period of benign neglect, though, the colonists in North America were pretty much free to do what they wanted. So Virginians, who did they sell tobacco to? Whoever would pay the best price. Who did New England work with? Whoever would pay the best price, right? This loyalty to England that they were supposed to express, they didn't, because there was no mechanism to force them to do so. Until the 1650s, when the Navigation Acts were passed. The Navigation Acts were intended to tighten trade between the colonies and England. But specifically, the Navigation Acts were intended to stop smuggling. Smuggling in terms of, England's working with the Dutch, England's working with, the colonists are working with the Dutch, the colonists are working with the French. The Navigation Acts were intended to stop that. The Navigation Acts were, well, navigation of the sea, right? There were laws passed such that, okay, so you can only ship your goods on English ships with English sailors, would be an example of one. Or all ships need to be inspected. All these different kind of mechanisms to try to cut down on the colonists trading with non-Englishmen. The Navigation Acts were put in place in the 1650s. Problem was there was no mechanism to enforce it. So let me ask you, what good is a law that you don't enforce? You guys have a habit of obeying laws that are not, that are not going to be enforced? What if you knew, I don't know how many of you have to drive in, on M60 to campus. What if you knew that you would never, ever, on your way to school, encounter a police officer? Would you drive the speed limit? Would you drive 55? If you knew, you would never see a police officer. Be honest. So you just assume you're never going to see the police and you drive what speed you want to drive. Yeah. Now, hear me clearly when I say this, because a student a few years ago suggested I should, in his course evaluation, suggested I should be fired because I was bragging about driving 90 miles an hour down M60. I did not drive 90 miles an hour down M60. That's not what I said. What I said was, if I knew that I would never see police on M60, look, that's like a straight shot, and I got a 6-cylinder engine. I'm going 90 miles an hour down that road if I know I'm never going to see police. But I know that I might see police. So I occasionally hit 70. I don't mean to. Like 65 is, I try to, they give you about 7 miles. So I take that 7 miles, okay, 8 or 10. But I know I obey the laws. I don't go 90 miles an hour. So please don't try to get me fired. Okay. I don't like that. So the Navigation Acts are not, oh, sorry, that's at 1650, 1660, 1663. I'm contradicting my own self. The Navigation Acts were put into effect, but they were never enforced until the 1690s. William and Mary have now assumed control of England. Politically, everything's settling down. Parliament's like, you know what? Those colonists are still smuggling. They're still working with the Dutch and the French behind our backs. We need to do something about it. So this group known as the Lords of Trade were tasked with how do we get our imperial house in order? What do we need to do to make sure that we can reap the most profit out of our colonies? And part of that was, hey, maybe we should enforce the Navigation Acts. Maybe we should put police officers over there to actually enforce the laws. And so that's what you see popping up in the 1690s. You see new courts in the port cities of the colonies. So places like Boston and Philly, New York, you see new mechanisms to police smuggling. They're actually enforcing the navigation. And guess what happens? The Americans continue to smuggle, but not nearly as much as they did before. For a couple of reasons. One is because there are actually policemen now. There are actually courts to prosecute smuggling. But two, it's also because England is doing pretty well in the 1700s. You gain a pretty good price. You're working with countrymen. So just the cultural connection there. The reality is that most people chose to abide by the navigation, right? Almost nobody in the period of crisis, the 15 years before the actual Declaration of Independence in 1776, almost no American is complaining about the navigation. It's not a big deal, largely because everybody's making a decent amount of money off of this relationship, but it's also because the colonists knew they accepted the enforcement of the navigation. So my point is, politically, economically, after 1689, the colonists are becoming more connected to England, not less. I know Maclay stresses some different things like how political systems are developing and stuff like that. But there's a mountain of evidence that suggests that the colonists are actually becoming tied closer to England, not further away. With increased political connections, increased economic connections, increased, all those things, shared politics, shared economic transactions produce shared identities or a common sense of identity. And that is what you have, right? With increased political affiliation, increased economic connection, increasst sense of a common identity. You see this especially through the increase in news. I think in 1720, there were 3 newspapers in the colonies. By 1740, there were 20 newspapers in the colonies. News is really important for creating a shared sense, shared experiences, and a shared sense of identity. I don't know, you're probably aged out of this example now, but 9/11, right? I mean, you were what, like 1 or 2 years old, so you're probably not sitting on mom and dad's lap watching 9/11, or at least you're not remembering it much, right? But and I can remember being in Indiana and watching the thing on the news, and I mean, all Americans, even if they had no connection to New York or the people who died on that day, felt that tragedy, that sense of loss, that was felt not just in the United States, that was felt globally. America hasn't been very friendly with Iran for a while, but after 9/11, even the Iranians were saying, we're all Americans now. Like we sympathize, we empathize with what you've gone through there, right? News creates a sense of affiliation, a sense of connection. The increased political connections, increased economic transactions, increases trade, travel, news, communication, all those things make for a common sense of being Englishmen. One of the great ironies of the American Revolution, we'll get to this by the end of lecture next week. One of the great ironies of the American Revolution is that it was carried out under the banner of defending the quote rights of Englishmen. It was Englishmen revolting against Englishmen in the name of defending the rights of Englishmen. Where did that common sense of identity come from? It was not there in the 1600s as the colonists were allowed to develop largely on their own. It's something that was manufactured in the years before the revolution. Religion. The Great Awakening, which you read about, was, and I'll leave Maclay to give you the details there. The Great Awakening was a transatlantic event, meaning it was not just happening in England and happening in North America, it was happening both places. The increased circulation of travel and news made it possible that the sense that God was at work. God was at work in like two places simultaneously. He was at work among one people. So, somebody's, Jonathan Edwards writes a book that's, the surprising work of God. I think 16, sorry, I'm going to forget. I'm not even going to do it. He writes this, 300 conversions in like 4 years, something like that. Amazing revival seeming to go on. English are like, because we got these, we got these Wesley brothers over here. That's sort of the Wesleys, maybe a Spring Arbor students. You heard of the Wesleys after this? Yeah. George Wycliffe. Well, we got these guys over here, and they're converting a lot of people too. I wonder. This is a common thing. So England, sends its pastors over to Edward's congregation who confirm, yes, hey, what he's saying is right. And Whitefield eventually comes over and is preaching over here. Of course, Methodism eventually makes its way across the ocean and takes root here in North America as well too. The Great Awakening was a transatlantic event. It's increasing connections between the colonists and England. So it's just ironic. The closer we get to 1776 and this great split in the colonies, the closer we get, the closer we seem to be getting to each other. There's a really ironic story, the story of the American Revolution, where it's people who had become more interconnected with each other that ultimately decide to part ways, or at least the colonists decide to part ways with motherland, and motherland didn't exactly want to part ways with us. Finally, culturally, a consumer revolution was afoot in the colonies at this time that increased connections between England and colonies. Why did George Washington look like a member of parliament? Because George Washington was part of the consumer revolution. The English did not invent consumer revolutions in many ways. Native Americans and Africans did. Native Americans were the ones who were trading animal pelts with the colonists, trading other things in order to get things they didn't really need, like metalworking goods and stuff. I mean, Native Americans, they kind of knew how to live here, but they traded with the colonists to get metalwork goods and eventually guns and stuff. They didn't really need the guns either, but they traded to get the guns. In part, because having these foreign-made goods and the ability to secure foreign-made goods gives you a kind of status and power over your neighbors, right? What we called, I think we called it before, conspicuous consumption. So this consumer revolution is going on across the Atlantic all through this time. The English are kind of late to the game, but they do get there in the 1700s. And the consumer revolution is simply this. The colonists are buying a lot of crap from England. All right, the colonists are buying a lot of crap from England. And that is going to increase those cultural connections and that sense of being a shared people. Partly the consumer revolution was England forced it to happen. For instance, England eventually passed laws making it illegal for the colonists to spin their own cloth, to make their own clothes. Well, why would England do that? Why would England make it illegal for the colonists to make their own clothes? Yeah, I mean, what was the basis of England's industrial revolution? Textiles, clothing. And so England, they're not idiots, right? We want our colonists sending us raw materials, like tobacco, and we want them buying our manufactured goods. We want them buying our clothes. Guaranteed markets for their products. So in part, the English had to buy from England because England forced them to do so. Right? This is the dependent nature of the colonies on the motherland. This is the way imperial relations were supposed to work. The colonies should be dependent upon and should be subservient to the mother country. But it's more than just kind of basic necessities that the colonists are buying. It's the playing cards and the purses and the kinds of cloth, the kinds of dresses, and the dresses aren't even like used yet, and they're still buying more dresses, and they're not just kind of spending what they have on these products. They're overspending. I know it's hard for you guys to relate to like an early generation of Americans like running up a lot of credit debt. Right? You guys can't appreciate that, right? But try to imagine a time in which Americans were spending more than they were earning, and they were going into debt doing so. This was the consumer revolution of the 1700s. The people we call our founding fathers were people who were a part of this consumer revolution. They were buying the latest fashions. They were buying the powdered wigs. They were buying you really wanted to show off your status. How do you get around a city like Boston or Philly in 1740? You want to get around quick. Horse? Few horses running around the cities at that time. You think cars have pollution problems? So you really want to get around in comfort, and you really want to stick it to your neighbors. You have one of the latest model carriages coming out of England. Your ability to purchase a carriage, a tricked out carriage from England, the latest model, have that shipped over across the Atlantic and parade around the streets of Boston or Philly or New York in your tricked out carriage. That was the essence of conspicuous consumption. That was the essence of the consumer revolution. People who call our founding fathers were people who were, I don't know how many of them were spending more than they had. Maybe the big name ones, I can't say for sure about that, but there was increasing numbers of Americans who are literally tied up in this consumer revolution. And certainly everything that flows from the buying of these products, right? The setting of like standards and tastes and what have you are things that are shaping, shaping the fashions, the mindsets, the identities of the colonists, including your George Washingtons and your Thomas Jeffersons and your John Adams. Those are guys who all tried to look like members of Parliament. These guys are all wore powdered wigs, whether they had hair or not. They did so because these were the fashions and styles of the day, and these were fashions and styles that were being set by England and then flowing out to the colonies. So again, we're talking about politics, economics, trade, news, culture. There are abundant signs that the people we call our founding fathers were, in fact, the new English. They were the people who are participating in these increased connections between England and her North American colonies. If that's the case, if these were people who increasingly are identified with England, why do they ultimately lead a revolution against England? So here's the thing. The people we call our founding fathers will learn two things from the English that will lead them eventually to declare independence. We'll talk about one of those today, and the other one we will talk about next week. The first thing that the people we call our founding fathers learned from England was a vision of what North America could be. A vision that they called the mighty empire, or a mighty empire. Don't take my word for it. There's a book called A Mighty Empire, which is trying to explain why did the founding fathers do what they did, what motivated, what drove them to do what they did. And so the guy Mark Engel wrote The Mighty Empire. And so pretty much everything I'm going over now is stuff that I derived from Engel's book. So if you want to fact check me, go and check out Engel's book. But what he did was just kind of study the letters and the public writings of the people we call our founding fathers, and did so before 1760, when the crisis with England was really heating up. And what he found was a competing, repeated use of this phrase, mighty empire. Look, in our stories of the founding fathers, we focus so much on one side of the coin, and that side is, what were the colonists upset about? Well, it was the taxes and the Quartering Act and the Intolerable Acts. All these things Maclay will talk about, or has talked about, from chapter 3, or the Lead to Independence, right? It's the problem with that story is it suggests that our founding fathers were just kind of blank slates. It's kind of going along without any kind of self-interest or any kind of sense of what they wanted their own society to be. And it was exclusively England's actions that led them to do what they did. No, we need to understand the driving factors. What they wanted, what the people we call our founding fathers, what they wanted to see happen in North America, and what they wanted to see was captured in that phrase, mighty empire. Now, there's one example of this, a letter from John Adams to a friend in 1755. I'm going to start a little bit down at the word may. Perhaps this apparently trivial incident, something that happened from English history, may transfer the great seat of empire into America. What Adams is suggesting is, hey, down the road, the British Empire might not be centered in England or in Britain. It might be centered in North America. Why, John? If we can remove the turbulent Gaelics, think French, our people out west, our people, according to the exactest computations, will in another century become more numerous than the people of England itself. The Americans at this time were the youngest population probably in the world, and young people like to have lots of babies. Our people, according to the exactest computations, will in another century become more numerous than England itself. Should this be the case, since we have, and we say, all the naval stores of the nation in our hands, will be easy to obtain the mastery of the seas, and the united force of all Europe will not be able to subdue us. What Adams is saying is, look, he's doing a good Enlightenment man project. Look around at the natural world, look around at the human world. What I see is people having lots of babies, and I see a lot of shoreline. I see a lot of rivers. I see a lot of good farmland. What I see is that North America is a place of abundance. What is England? A place of abundance? Maybe at some point in its history, but not anymore. England is a place that people were trying to get out by the tens of thousands every year. That's kind of slowed down, but still, England is a place of scarcity. It's an island. And so Adams is kind of crunching the numbers and saying, whoop, we already have more natural resources than England. Give another 34 years, we're going to have more people than England. What I see is that the British Empire is eventually going to be centered in the Americas, not in Europe. Now, Adams is not saying break away from England. Nobody in 1755 is saying break away from England. It would be ridiculous for the colonists to say, hey, let's break away from England. What's going on? See, I remember how good you remember the Maclay book. What's going on in 1755 in the colonies? Remember that war that takes place before the War for Independence? Yeah, the French and Indian War. We call it the French and Indian War. It's part of, it's a 9-year war that becomes part of the 7 Years' War, which is a global war between England and France and their different allies. But it begins in 1754 in the western boundaries of North America. So Adams is writing here in the midst of war. He's not saying, let's break away from England, right? The colonists need British protection against the French. I gotta say, the worst titled war ever. I mean, growing up, I hear French and Indian War. I'm thinking the French and the Indians are fighting each other. Where are the British in all this? Like, no, the French and the Indians were fighting against the British. So why did you call it the French and Indian War? Why don't you call it the French and British War? It confused me so bad. I don't know how I ever became a history teacher, because history just confused the crap out of me growing up. And one of those, like, French and Indian War is the stupidest name for a war ever. But it's the name that is stuck, right? We're in the midst of the French and Indian War. Nobody say, hey, let's break away from England at this time. But they are looking at, when Adam says remove those turbulent Gaelics, he's saying, look, if we win this war, then the French are gone from the West. If the French are gone from the West, well, according to the English imagination, there's no one else out there. Of course, there were people out there, Native Americans, but that doesn't really factor into English. It doesn't factor into Adams or English calculations. They figure either through disease or through trade, they're going to get that land. So they're all about, well, if we can get rid of the French out west, we're going to be able to expand out there. That term mighty empire, when you hear empire, don't think like Darth Vader, right? The empire. Empire in the 18th century just simply meant a vast territory. It was more of an empire, was largely a geographical concept. When Adams is talking about empire, he's talking about what we will eventually in this class, what you guys remember as Manifest Destiny from the 1840s, 1850s, right? God's design that we would fill up the continent. The people that call our founding fathers had been envisioning that expansion 100 years before we even started using it for American stuff. It was their solution to what they saw as a coming demographic problem. That demographic problem was our people are having a lot of kids. Our cities are going to become overpopulated like London became overpopulated. London had to export a lot of people. What are we going to do with our surplus population? Where are they going to go? And people like Adams and other founding fathers essentially have to be able to go west. They have to move into the interior. We have to move into the interior. That's our destiny. I mean, they didn't use that language of destiny and stuff. They thought a lot more in secular terms than theological. The theological comes in the 1800s with Manifest Destiny. In the 1700s, it's much more of an enlightenment thing. It's Adams using phrase like computations, right? It's like, let's just crunch the numbers here. Our population's growing. We're going to expand out west. We need to be able to move out there. They're looking at the French and Indian War for a couple of reasons. One, they see this as an opportunity to show to England, hey, we can defend ourselves. Put a pin in that. We'll talk more about that when we talk about Ben Franklin. The second thing, though, is they're saying is with British help, we are going to get rid of the French. We're going to remove them from the West. And once they do, then the British Empire here in North America can really begin to grow. Then we really can begin to expand. It's more than simply Adams. Almost all of the people we call our founding fathers had this vision of Western expansion 10, 15, 20 years before the actual decision for independence. So we know, right? I mean, what we stress in our history classes is what were the founding fathers against? They were against tyranny. They were against taxes. They were against the quartering of soldiers in American homes. But we never asked what were the founding fathers for? What did they want to do? And what we know they wanted to do is they wanted the freedom to expand west. They wanted to be able to export our growing populations, move them out west. For immediate and long-term gain, let's talk about Ben Franklin, if we can. You guys remember Ben Franklin, guy who invented electricity? No. Students will sometimes, check out it. Just, well, I know Ben Franklin. Yeah, he flew a kite and had a T on the end of it, and blah blah blah. You know, your grade school Ben Franklin. No, the Ben Franklin of history that's important is Ben Franklin, the great imperialist. Franklin was the guy who took ideas like Adams and other of the people we call our founding fathers. Adams is the guy who took those ideas and ran with them. Ben Franklin was a staunch advocate of expansion into North America, not just west, actually to the north. So in 1754, Franklin's a newsman, I should say too. Right, I talked about the importance of the expansion of the news. Franklin is a part of this kind of new Englishman phenomenon of somebody who is taking kind of the news of England and spreading that throughout the colonies, and also trying to work with that to try to secure North America's future. And Franklin, like Adams and others as founding fathers, saw America's future through territorial expansion, a vast territorial expansion that they called the mighty empire. If I still knew where my notes were and stuff, I had pastors talking about, he thinks they see a mighty empire and great cities on every hill throughout North America, right? It's even pastors who are engaging in this kind of speculation. But we're going to focus on Ben Franklin here. He writes a couple of pamphlets that reveal his thinking. 1754, a plan for settling 2 Western colonies. Right, clearly Franklin has Western expansion on the mind of the colonists. Our future lays out west. Our future lies through expansion west. We can just get rid of those French. The Canada pamphlet. Try to imagine a time in which Americans were very worried that Canada might someday invade us. That was just, the people we call our founding fathers, they were very worried about Canada. And they were constantly trying to think of ways in which they could conquer Canada before Canada conquered us. They thought it would be through war. They didn't realize it would come through Justin Bieber, but Canada has kind of won. So it's all right. Scott Pilgrim versus the world too. But Franklin is thinking about expansion, not just west, but expansion north as well too, into present day Canada as well. it's why he's going even beyond Adams and others in trying to make this happen. So 1754, war between French and British colonists break out. You have the details of that war and how that works out. George Washington's involvement, it's all in the McCrae textbook. I don't need to go into that level of detail here. You can read that in the book. What's important to know, though, is how Adams responded to that. This war could not have come at a worse time. The English had a deal. I forget what it was called, like the Great Chain, or they had this like nearly 100-year deal with Iroquois. Where the English and the Iroquois, I mean, actually, the Iroquois kind of played both sides. The Iroquois had the same kind of deal with the French. In the French and Indian War, some Iroquois fought on the side of the French, some Iroquois fought on the side of the British. But in 1754, that great chain was broken. The Iroquois were just like, all right, we're just going all in with the French. We were sick of the English. It panicked the English, specifically Ben Franklin. Specifically when the French and Indians began to mobilize against the colonists. And so Franklin sent word throughout Indian country, but also word throughout the colonies too. We need to, we're not used to working together, but we have a common problem here, right? You can't fight a war against the French and Native Americans as Massachusetts going alone, and Virginia going alone, and South Carolina going alone. Like, we need to figure out how to work together. So Franklin, right as this war is just beginning to kind of shape up, Franklin calls people together to Albany, New York. All the colonies send representatives, the Iroquois send representatives too. So they're gathering in Albany, New York in 1754. Where Franklin is going to introduce his Albany Plan of Union. Part of what the conference was intended to do was to reestablish the great chain between the English and the Iroquois, and Franklin was able to do that. Like, the Iroquois, like I said, some Iroquois fight on the side of the British in the war, some fight on the side of the French. But he reestablished that chain. The other thing, though, that he wants to do is to create a, well, to use contemporary terms, to create a central government for the colonies. The Plan of Union was the first attempt in British North America to create the kind of united colonies or United States or Confederacy, whatever you want to call it. The Albany Plan of Union in 1754 is really the first attempt to try to do this. Franklin himself would say part of his reason for doing it was because of interviews he had with the Iroquois. He would run a story in the front page of Poor Richard's Almanac where he's quoting an Iroquois chief who was telling him the story of Daganoweda. And this Iroquois chief was apparently telling Franklin, hey, you guys need to figure out how to get along like we did. Like we built the first United States of North America, the Iroquois did. The Iroquois Confederacy was the first United States of North America. Now you guys need to do what we did. One of the reasons I say that is because there are Iroquois scholars today who still will make the claim that the U.S. Constitution was patterned after the Iroquois Confederacy. They're wrong. All right, they're wrong. There's no direct connection there. There is a little bit more connection between the Albany Plan of Union and the Iroquois Confederacy. Just because, but it's not like a direct influence. I mean, Franklin knew what he wanted to do. It's just he used the Iroquois story to kind of help push this idea. Hey, Native Americans already did this. We should do it too. But just know that the Iroquois, there's Iroquois scholars today who make the argument that the U.S. Constitution was actually patterned, was actually developed by the Iroquois themselves. That's where they get this idea from. It comes from Ben Franklin. His article. The Plan of Union called for the creation of a central government that's not that different from our central government today. there would be an elected, I think it was called like a General Assembly. I forget exactly what it was called. You know, think of present day Congress or Parliament, that there would be a General Assembly where each of the colonies would elect leaders to, and the king would appoint a kind of president. The Albany Plan of Union that Franklin is pushing out here is, to him, it's just, it kind of makes sense. So, look, the French and Indian War is not an attack on this colony or this colony or this colony. It's an attack on all the colonies at the same time. And so we need a united front against a united enemy. It just is common sense, right? We need a united front against the common. There's some things that we have to do together, we can't do independently. And so wouldn't it be good to have a mechanism like a central government to be able to deal with existential threats like the French and Indian War? The Albany Plan of Union is good enough that people at Albany are like, yeah, this is a great idea. It's sent back to the States, and everybody's like, oh. You're wondering, like, why did I never hear about the Albany Plan of Union? Because it doesn't go anywhere. Right? Even the king's like, I thought it was a good idea. But so the Albany Plan of Union is not significant because it becomes like a model for the U.S. Constitution. Franklin will be at the Constitutional Convention. He mentions that, yeah, a few years ago, I tried to do this thing, the Albany Plan of Union didn't really go anywhere, and he just kind of mentions it, but it's not like they used it as a model. So its significance really is not in that it becomes like a model for what would happen. Its significance really is more in helping to reveal Franklin's and our founding fathers' thinking at this time, which is we have to prepare for expansion and the conflicts that will come with expansion, right? Why does the French and Indian War occur? It's because the colonists already were expanding into French and Indian territory, right? They already were moving into that territory. We have to prepare for these common threats in the future if we are going to succeed as a mighty empire. And so understand Franklin's significance. He's, along with other founding fathers like John Adams and Jefferson and Washington, he's somebody who's seeing America's future as laying out west. And we need to begin to build an apparatus here in North America to prepare for that. Franklin is not, however, in 1754. He is not saying, let's break away from England. Nobody's saying, let's break away from England. That would be suicidal. They need England. They need the Redcoats to defend them against the French and the Indians. George Washington, I don't know how much Maclay revealed, George Washington ain't getting it done in those first couple of years. He's pretty bad. Now, by the end of the war, he's actually pretty good. And he'll be awesome in the war for independence. But he doesn't start out very well. He's no Stonewall Jackson, for instance. And so Franklin's not saying, hey, let's break away from England. Instead, he writes an article in 1754. He says, you know, oh, let not England seek to oppress us, but rather like a tender parent give freedom to her children. This is how imperial relations were talked about during these years as family relations. The relationship between motherland and the colonies is like a relationship between a mother and her children. And England is saying, or sorry, Franklin is simply saying in 1754, hey, mom, dad, time to let us grow up. How many of you hope to have kids someday? Right, a lot of you. How many of you, your aspiration for your future child is, I hope when my son or daughter is 35 years old, they're living in our basement, completely dependent upon my earnings. Anyone, that's your vision? Your vision is your child will be totally dependent upon you even into adulthood. No, because that's not normal, right? That's not natural, right? Dependence early on, but the parents are supposed to raise the kid for independence. And at some point, the kid is supposed to be able to stand on their own, right? I love my son, great son. But at some point, he's got to go. He's 13. At some point, he's got to go. I want my wife back. Guys, you don't know this, but that's what they do. Particularly the boys. They steal your wives. I haven't really had a wife for about 13 years. And I want my wife back because the boys take them. So again, I love my son. I'm not gonna kick him out next year or something like that. But he's also not going to be living in my basement when he's 35 years old, completely dependent upon me. He's not going to be living in my basement when he's 18 years old, completely dependent upon me. I lived with my parents till I was 27 years old, but I was always working towards something. I had health complications that set me back, but I was always working towards something. And I'll tell that to my son, like, look, as long as you're working towards conditions of independence for yourself, you can stay here. We'll take care of you. But if that's not happening, you're out in the street. I might be a little bit nicer about it, but because that's the way this is supposed to work, right? The kid's supposed to grow up and is supposed to leave, and be able to stand on their own, become independent, and know how to use their independence because mom and dad have raised them to be responsible in the use of their independence. That is what Franklin is asking from England. Let us grow up. Thanks for taking care of us. Thanks for all the food and shelter and everything. Thanks for killing a lot of French and Indians for us. But it's time for us to grow up. It's time for you to give us more freedom. Maybe lay off the navigation acts a little bit. Maybe give us a little bit more independence from the royal governor. Just allow us to grow up a little bit more. From what you know about the period between 1754 and 1776, does England allow the colonies to grow up? Is that what happens? Does England give more freedom to her colonies between 1754 or 1770, or even between the end of the war, 1763 and 1776? Does England give more freedom to her colonies? Many of you have read about this already for your third discussion board. That's not what happens. And we'll talk about kind of why England is doing what England. There's always two sides, at least two sides to a story. We'll look at England's side and try to understand why England was so perplexed at the colonists claiming that they were somehow being tyrannized. But in order to understand why the colonists, and particularly the people we call our founding fathers, why they freaked out the way they did after 1763, we need to understand what they wanted. Not just what they were against, but what they were for. And what they were for was Western expansion. What they were for was a vision of becoming a mighty empire, a vision that was derived from England itself, right? If you went back and look at a recorded version of this eventually, you can look at where Adams actually begins that letter, and he's taking you through English history. Hey, look, England started out as kind of Spring Arbor, and really made something of itself. I guess I'm picking on Spring Arbor for not making something of itself. I'm gonna pick on some former students. Bad Axe. There. England started out as Bad Axe. It really made something of itself. That's one of the sentence. Anyways, we had the chance to do that too. Yeah, we're kind of a third-rate country right now, but we had the chance to become a mighty empire. England did too. So their model, the thing that they are learning from England, is the thing that will lead them eventually to break away from England, particularly when England threatens that vision. And that's how the war ends. The war ends on a breaking points between England and her colonies. It ends with the passage in 1763 of the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So this is our final subject, is the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Essentially, I'm going to let you picture it. It's the original red and blue state divide in America, I guess. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 is this imaginary line that divides the western boundaries of the colonies with Indian country. Why did England draw this line? It had to do with how the war wrapped up. I'll go back to that map in a minute. It had to do with how the war wrapped up. The handwriting was on the wall for Native Americans in Indian country. They're seeing, oh, we chose the wrong side. The French aren't going to win this fight. What are we going to do? How are we going to respond? In 1760, a sorcerer began to a kind of revival, a revival among Native Americans to kind of recover the old ways, to abandon trade and connections with the English, the palefaces. Native Americans, even during these years, began developing new creation stories. The creation stories that Native Americans told when the colonists are originally coming in the 1600s, the Native Americans were in many ways monotheists. We talked about a great creator creating a kind of common humanity. By the time we get to the 1760s, we see Native Americans telling new creation stories that God created not one race of people, but he created white men, black men, and red men, and they should stay separate from each other. And so this revival taking place in Indian country is calling Native Americans back to the old ways. A person who imbibes that message is a man named Chief Pontiac. Now, you know Pontiac? Yeah, you know Pontiac, Michigan. Yeah. Pontiac. Pontiac does something that Native Americans don't normally do. He begins going around not just to his own people, but to his traditional enemies, and says, look, we have a common threat. The French, who we've been trying to use to play off against the English, the French are done here. It's just us against the English now. We need to send a message as quickly as we can. That the English cannot just expand into our territory wherever they want. Pontiac assembles this kind of intercultural, inter-native army and begins attacking British forts and very successfully attacking British forts. It takes the British a couple years to kind of get their feet under them. I mean, here they are. They thought that the problem was the French, and suddenly 1760, 1762, the British find themselves fighting Pontiac and his forces. And it's something they weren't used to. Because it's not just one tribe or one nation, it's this collection of this confederacy that Pontiac has put together to fight against the British. And the British are freaked out by it. Yes, the British ultimately put down Pontiac's rebellion. They're successful, but they also kind of realize this is the first of more rebellions to come. As long as the colonists keep moving out west, it's going to spark more Chief Pontiacs. And we're going to have to incur the human cost, actually the financial cost of keeping the Red Coat Army here permanently to defend these colonists with their insatiable desire for Western expansion. This is a message that's sent back to the king. The colonists are going to keep involving us in wars against Native. I mean, the French are gone, but they're going to keep involving us in wars against Native Americans. We're going to keep doing this to us. And the king and the parliament are like, okay, we got a simple solution to that. How do we prevent future Pontiac rebellions? How do we preserve the integrity of Indian country? How do we send a message to future Chief Pontiacs? Hey, The colonists are going to leave you alone. We'll keep them under control. Enter the Royal Proclamation of 1763. The king and parliament draw a line. Hey, colonists, don't cross the line. But the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was really sending a message to Native Americans. Hey, don't do this. Don't go to war against us again. And know you guys are worried about Western expansion. We're stopping it. We've drawn a line. The colonists are not going to cross the line. So don't freak out. Everybody calm down. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 sent a message to Native Americans, calm down. Let's not keep a perpetual war with each other. It sent a very different message to the colonists. What was that message? Dad doesn't want us to grow up. Mom doesn't want us to grow up. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 looked like mom and dad saying, get down in that basement until you're 35. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 was not received well for a couple of reasons. The first reason, it hurt people financially. It hurt colonists financially, including people we call our founding fathers. When the French and Indian War broke out, but here's the thing, a lot of our founding fathers were speculators. Speculators were like, it's the equivalent of people who play the stock market today. Speculators were people who were looking, all right, I got some extra money here. How do I invest this in something that I can buy low and sell high? The major thing people speculated in during these years was land. Where's land that I can get? Where's land that I can get dirt cheap? With the prospect that eventually I'll be able to sell that land to the government or to settlers in the future, I can sell that land. Most of our founding fathers were, well, many of our founding fathers were speculators. George Washington was a big speculator. He had agents running around the colonies looking to buy up land cheap with the prospect that he would be able to sell high in the future. And one of the places these guys are speculating was in Indian country. So Jefferson, when he hears about the French and Indian War, when he hears about his buddy George Washington going off to fight Native Americans in Indian country, Jefferson says, all right, let's buy some land. And Jefferson buys up thousands of acres of land in Indian country, on the hopes that eventually that land will become part of British territory. And he'll be able to sell it to the government and sell it to future settlers. They better sell it high, right? We have to get past this idea that our founding fathers were people who were like selfless or only concerned about others. No, they were self-interested men, just like we're all self-interested. They were looking to increase, they were wealthy individuals who were looking to increase their wealth, just like we all would be. Right? We all look to increase our wealth. And that's what the people we call our founding fathers, that's what they were trying to do. Thomas Jefferson, he's trying to do it through land speculation, buying up land in Indian country. Jefferson had a friend borrowed 100,000 pounds of public money from Virginia to buy up land in Indian country. One of the things that's leading Virginians to follow incompetence like George Washington in the battle. Again, initially incompetent, great war hero, eventually, initially not so great. What's leading Virginians to follow George Washington into battle against Native Americans and French in 1755 and 1756? What's leading them to do? Because they were promised land. Washington and his soldiers were promised land. Hey, if you go out and take this land from the French, you're going to get paid in land. So, a number of colonists, including people who call our founding fathers, had claims on Native American land, had claims on Indian country land. They were looking for a particular kind of outcome in this war, a French loss, so they could lay claim to that land and eventually sell it high, make a nice profit off of it. Now, do you understand why the proclamation was a bit of a problem? What comes of all their land claims? They're all void of all the money Jefferson spent buying up land in Indian country. Ain't going to happen. What about that guy who borrowed 100,000 pounds? How's he going to pay that back? He's not. He commits suicide. But George Washington is not going to get that land. Look, Virginians, they don't stop trying to get that land. They're still fighting Native Americans in Indian country in 1775. Right, 1776, remember independence? 1775, Virginia is out there in Indian country fighting Native Americans because they're still trying to get that land. So in the short run, the Royal Proclamation was a problem because it hurt the economic interests of many colonists, many wealthy colonists, including some of our founding fathers. In the longer run, it really threw this vision of a mighty empire into jeopardy. Adams and others are saying we have to be able to expand out west. Otherwise, our populations are going to become overcrowded. And we're going to have all the kinds of problems with like poverty and conflict and class conflict. We're going to have all those problems if we can't expand out west. The Royal Proclamation, right? I mean, the war ends with the French are gone. We can finally move out west. Yay! And England comes along and says, sorry, you guys can't move out west. It looks like England is saying, sorry, 18-year-old son or daughter, you don't get to grow up. When do I get to grow up? Let's wait and see. How well does 18-year-old son or daughter take that? And that's kind of where we're at in 1763. What should have been a unifying moment between the colonies and England, this victory in the French-Indian War, instead becomes the first crisis. The first conflict of interest, suggesting to several of the colonists, including the people who call our founding fathers, suggesting maybe we're not going to be able to do this with England. Maybe there's going to be a separation down here. Now, Maclay's right to stress taxes and all that kind of stuff, but we do have to keep in mind, because all throughout this period, the people we call our founding fathers were people who were looking to expand out west, to build a mighty empire. That's what they wanted. You can't understand the founding fathers if you just understand what they were against. You need to understand what they were for, and what they were for was Western expansion, and they thought England was stopping them from doing it. Good luck writing those midterms.